The commanding officer's voice cut through the Montana morning air like a blade through silk. "Martinez! Front and center! Now!" Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell stood perfectly still, her combat boots planted firmly on the asphalt of Fort Harrison's main parade ground. Around her, 200 soldiers snapped to attention in perfect unison, their movements crisp and synchronized, all except one. Staff Sergeant Elena Martinez remained motionless, her dark eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the flagpole. She didn't flinch when Mitchell's voice boomed across the formation. She didn't move when every other soldier's head turned toward her. She simply stood there, as if carved from stone. The silence that followed was suffocating. In the military, orders were absolute. Hesitation was weakness. Defiance was unthinkable. Yet here, in front of the entire battalion, Martinez had done the unthinkable. Mitchell's jaw tightened as she strode toward the frozen sergeant. Her boots clicked against the pavement in measured steps, each one echoing like a countdown. The other soldiers watched with barely concealed shock. Martinez had been with the unit for 8 months, and in all that time she'd been nothing but reliable, quiet, competent, unremarkable, the kind of soldier who followed orders without question and never caused problems. Until now. "Sergeant Martinez," Mitchell's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper as she stopped 3 feet away. "I gave you a direct order. Step forward." Elena's hands remained steady at her sides, but something flickered behind her eyes. Not defiance, but something deeper. Something that looked almost like recognition. As if seeing Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell had triggered a memory she'd been trying to forget. The morning sun caught the silver eagles on Mitchell's collar, casting small shadows across her weathered face. She'd earned those eagles through 15 years of distinguished service, 3 combat deployments, and more difficult decisions than she cared to count. She'd never had a soldier openly defy her. Not like this. "Martinez." The name came out like a growl. "Move! Now!" But Elena Martinez didn't move. She couldn't, because standing in front of her wasn't just any commanding officer. It was the woman she'd crawled through hell to save 3 years ago in Afghanistan. The woman whose blood she'd felt warm and sticky on her hands as she'd applied pressure to a sucking chest wound. The woman who looked up at her with eyes full of terror and whispered, "Don't let me die here." The woman who was supposed to be dead. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell had no idea that the sergeant standing before her was the combat medic who'd dragged her broken body across 50 yards of open ground while insurgent bullets whistled overhead. She didn't know that Elena Martinez had once been Corporal Elena Santos, 68 Duddy Beats Combat Medical Specialist, attached to the 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. She didn't know, because Elena Santos had died that day too. At least that's what the after-action report said. The attack on Forward Operating Base Chapman had come without warning. One moment, Elena was updating medical supplies in the aid station. The next, mortars were raining down like deadly hail, and the entire compound was under siege. She'd grabbed her aid bag and sprinted toward the sound of screaming, muscle memory yet taking over where conscious thought failed. She'd found then Major Mitchell pinned under a collapsed concrete barrier, her left lung punctured by a piece of rebar, blood frothing from her mouth with each labored breath. The smart play would have been to radio for a medevac and wait for extraction. But the landing zone was under fire, and Mitchell was dying fast. So Elena had made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She'd stayed. For 47 minutes, she'd kept Sarah Mitchell alive using nothing but field dressings, morphine, and sheer stubborn will. When the evacuation helicopter finally touched down, Elena had carried Mitchell to safety on her back, her own body shielding the wounded officer from sniper fire. The helicopter had taken off with Mitchell inside, racing toward the trauma center at Bagram Airfield. Elena never found out if she'd made it. 3 hours later, another mortar round hit the aid station directly. According to the official casualty report, Corporal Elena Santos was killed instantly. Her remains were never recovered from the rubble. But Elena hadn't died that day. She'd been thrown clear by the blast, suffering a traumatic brain injury that left her unconscious for 6 weeks and with no memory of who she was or why she was in a field hospital in Germany. When she finally woke up, she was just another wounded soldier with no identification and no past. The Army had given her a new name, a new identity, a new life. Elena Martinez, they called her. A logistics specialist who'd been injured in a convoy attack. Clean record, no family, no complications. It had taken her 2 years to recover her memories, and by then, starting over seemed easier than trying to explain why Corporal Elena Santos wasn't actually dead. She'd re-enlisted under her new identity, requesting assignment to a unit far from her old life. She'd thought she was safe. She'd thought she could serve quietly and honorably until she'd earned enough to disappear completely. She'd never expected to see Sarah Mitchell again. Now, standing on this parade ground in Montana, Elena felt the weight of 3 years' worth of secrets pressing down on her shoulders. The woman she'd saved was alive, breathing, standing right in front of her, and Elena couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at the living ghost of her past. Mitchell's patience finally snapped. "Martinez, you have 10 seconds to explain yourself before I have you arrested for insubordination." Elena's mouth opened, then closed. How could she explain? How could she tell her commanding officer that she'd once held her life in her hands? That she'd watched her blood pool in the Afghan dirt and had sworn she'd never let another soldier die on her watch? How could she explain that seeing Mitchell alive and whole and strong was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she'd ever experienced? The seconds ticked by like hours. Around them, 200 soldiers held their breath, waiting to see what would happen when an unstoppable force met an immovable object. In the distance, a bugle played a reveille, the notes floating across the base like a prayer. Elena Martinez closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and prepared to step forward into the unknown. But before she could move, a voice cut through the tension like a knife through flesh. "Stand down, Colonel!" Every head turned toward the source of the command. Brigadier General Robert Hayes stepped out of the base headquarters building, his star gleaming in the morning sun. His presence commanded immediate respect, but there was something else in his expression, something that looked almost like concern. Mitchell's eyebrows shot up. In 15 years of service, she'd never been countermanded in front of her own troops. "Sir, with respect, this soldier is exactly where she needs to be." Hayes finished, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. He walked across the parade ground with measured steps, his eyes never leaving Elena's frozen form. "Sergeant Martinez, you're dismissed. Report to my office in 20 minutes. Elena's head snapped up, confusion flickering across her features. She'd never met General Hayes before. At least she didn't think she had. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition that made her stomach clench with dread. The formation began to break apart as soldiers were dismissed to their daily duties, but not before casting curious glances between their paralyzed sergeant and their bewildered commanding officer. Mitchell remained rooted in place, her authority challenged in the most public way possible. "Sir," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I need to understand what just happened here." Hayes turned to face her, and for a moment, Elena caught something in his expression that made her blood run cold. It was the same look she'd seen on the face of every superior officer who'd ever carried a secret too heavy to bear. "Walk with me, Sarah," he said quietly, using her first name in a way that suggested their relationship went deeper than the chain of command. "There are things you need to know." As they walked away, Elena felt her legs finally unlock. She took a shaky step forward, then another, her body remembering how to move now that the immediate threat had passed. But her mind was racing with questions that had no easy answers. Who was General Hayes? How did he know her? And why had he just saved her from what should have been a career-ending moment of insubordination? 20 minutes later, Elena found herself standing outside the general's office, her hand raised to knock. Through the door she could hear voices. Hayes and Mitchell engaged in what sounded like a heated discussion. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Someone's career was about to change forever. The door opened before she could knock, and Mitchell emerged, her face pale and her eyes wide with shock. She looked at Elena for a long moment, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and finally, something that might have been awe. "Jesus Christ," she whispered so quietly that Elena almost didn't hear her. "You're her. You're really her." Before Elena could respond, Mitchell was gone, striding down the hallway with the mechanical precision of someone trying very hard not to break apart. Elena watched her disappear around a corner, then turned to face the open doorway where General Hayes waited. "Come in, Corporal Santos," he said, using the name she hadn't heard in 3 years. "We have a lot to discuss." Elena's knees nearly buckled. Corporal Santos. The name hit her like a physical blow, dragging with it a flood of memories she'd spent years trying to suppress. The smell of cordite and blood, the sound of incoming mortars, the weight of Sarah Mitchell's body as she'd carried her to safety. "How?" she managed to whisper as she stepped into the office. "How do you know?" Hayes closed the door behind her and gestured to a chair. His office was Spartanly decorated. A few commendations, a photograph of him with various military officials, and on his desk, a small wooden box that looked oddly familiar. "Because I was there," he said simply. "I was the one who authorized your extraction from Chapman. I was the one who signed the casualty report declaring Elena Santos KIA. And I was the one who gave the order to create Elena Martinez when you woke up in that German hospital with no memory of who you were." Elena sank into the chair, her world tilting on its axis. "You knew. All this time you knew." "I've been tracking your career for 3 years," Hayes continued, settling behind his desk. "Making sure you were safe, making sure your new identity held up. I never expected our paths to cross again, and I certainly never expected you to end up serving under the woman you saved." "Sarah doesn't remember," Elena said, more statement than question. "She remembers fragments. Trauma does that, blocks out some memories while making others crystal clear. She remembers being wounded, remembers being saved by a medic, but the face..." He shrugged. "Brain injuries are funny things. Sometimes they protect us from remembering what we're not ready to handle." Elena's hands trembled in her lap. "Why didn't you let me die? It would have been easier." Hayes leaned forward, his expression growing stern. "Because losing you would have been a waste. You saved 8 soldiers that day, Santos. 8 men and women who went home to their families because you refused to give up. That's not the kind of person the Army lets slip away." "But I did slip away. I became someone else." "You became who you needed to become to survive. There's no shame in that." He opened the wooden box on his desk and pulled out a small piece of metal. Elena's breath caught in her throat. It was her dog tag, the real one, the one that said Santos Elena M., with her real service number and blood type. "I've been carrying this for 3 years, Hayes said, sliding it across the desk toward her, "waiting for the day when you were ready to be yourself again." Elena stared at the tag but didn't reach for it. "What if I'm not ready? What if I never am?" "Then that's your choice, but Elena..." He paused, using her real first name with deliberate care. "Sarah Mitchell requested a transfer this morning. She's putting in for a deployment to Syria. She says she needs to get away from whatever ghosts are haunting this place." The words hit Elena like a slap. Sarah was running. Again. Just like she had run from Elena's memory, Sarah was running from the confusion and pain of almost recognition. "She doesn't know it's you," Hayes continued, "but she knows something's wrong. Something's eating at her, and she can't figure out what. Maybe it's time she learned the truth." Elena finally reached for the dog tag, her fingers closing around the familiar metal. It was warm from Hayes' touch, solid and real in a way that Elena Martinez had never quite managed to be. "What happens if I tell her?" "I don't know, but I know what happens if you don't. She spends the rest of her life wondering why she feels like she owes a debt to a ghost. And you spend the rest of yours wondering if the woman you saved was worth saving." Elena stood, slipping the dog tag into her pocket. It felt strange to carry her real name again, like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit. "I need time to think. You have until 1700 hours, Hayes said. "That's when her transfer paperwork gets processed. After that, she's gone, and you'll never get another chance." Elena nodded and turned toward the door, but Hayes' voice stopped her. "Santos?" She turned back. "For what it's worth, I think she deserves to know that heroes still exist, even if they don't always look like we expect them to." Elena stepped out of the office and into the Montana sunshine, her mind churning with possibilities and fears. Somewhere across the base, Sarah Mitchell was packing her belongings and preparing to run from demons she couldn't name. But Elena Santos, the real Elena Santos, was finally ready to stop running from hers. The question was, would she be brave enough to face them? Elena found Sarah Mitchell in the base motor pool at 1630 hours, methodically checking fluid levels in a Humvee that clearly didn't need maintenance. Her movements were precise but agitated, like someone trying to keep busy to avoid thinking. The motor pool was nearly empty, most soldiers having finished their duties for the day. The smell of diesel fuel and motor oil hung heavy in the air, mixing with the dust that seemed to coat everything on Fort Harrison. Elena watched from the doorway for a long moment, studying the woman she'd once saved. Sarah looked different than she remembered. Older, obviously, but also harder somehow. The soft edges that trauma had worn away, leaving behind someone who moved with the careful precision of a person who'd learned that the world could explode without warning. Elena's hand unconsciously moved to her pocket, where the dog tag waited like a loaded weapon. "You planning to stand there all day, Martinez?" Sarah's voice cut through the silence without her even looking up from the engine compartment. Elena stepped into the garage, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. I heard you put in for a transfer. Sarah finally straightened, wiping her hands on a shop rag. When she turned to face Elena, there was something raw in her eyes, something that looked like recognition wrestling with impossibility. News travels fast on a base this size. Sarah's voice was carefully neutral, but Elena caught the slight tremor underneath. What's it to you? Elena moved closer, close enough to see the thin white scar that ran along Sarah's left temple, a souvenir from Afghanistan that the medical reports hadn't mentioned, close enough to see that Sarah's hands, steady as they appeared, shook almost imperceptibly. I know you, Elena said quietly, and you know me. Sarah's jaw tightened. I don't know what game you're playing, Martinez, but Chapman Forward Operating Base, October 15th, 2021. You were pinned under a concrete barrier with a punctured lung and a piece of rebar through your chest cavity. The color drained from Sarah's face. The shop rag fell from the nerveless fingers. How do you... Sarah's voice cracked. How could you possibly know that? Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out the dog tag, holding it between them like a bridge across 3 years of lies and silence. Because I was there. I was the medic who kept you alive for 47 minutes while we waited for dust-off. I was the one who carried you to the helicopter when you were too weak to walk. Sarah stared at the dog tag, reading the name engraved there. Santos? Elena M. Her eyes snapped up to Elena's face, searching for something, some proof that this wasn't an elaborate delusion. But you died, Sarah whispered. The casualty report said, they told me my medic was killed in a mortar attack. I went to your memorial service. I should have died. Elena's voice was steady now, strengthened by finally speaking the truth. The blast threw me clear, but I was unconscious for 6 weeks. When I woke up in Germany, I had no memory, no identification. They gave me a new name, a new life. By the time I remembered who I was, it seemed easier to stay dead. Sarah slumped against the Humvee, her legs suddenly unsteady. 3 years. 3 goddamn years I've been carrying around the guilt of surviving when you didn't. 3 years of nightmares where I watched you die over and over again because I was too weak to save myself. Elena felt something break open inside her chest. You weren't supposed to carry that. You were supposed to live. You were supposed to go home and forget about the medic who was just doing her job. Just doing your job? Sarah's voice rose, anger flashing in her eyes. You crawled through 50 yards of enemy fire to reach me. You performed field surgery with mortars falling around us. You stayed with me when any rational person would have run for cover. That wasn't just doing your job. That was... What? Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. That was love. Not romantic love, but the kind of love that says, your life matters more than mine. The kind of love that doesn't ask questions or weigh odds. It just acts. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes. I lost 3 men that day. 3 soldiers died because I chose to stay with you instead of... Stop. Sarah's command was sharp, cutting through Elena's self-recrimination like a blade. I've read the after-action reports, Santos. All of them. Those men died because of bad intelligence and an enemy ambush. You saved 8 lives that day, including mine. Don't you dare dishonor their sacrifice by pretending it was your fault. The garage fell silent, except for the distant sound of evening formation being called across the base. Elena realized she was crying, not the careful, contained tears she'd allowed herself over the years, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone finally letting go of a burden too heavy to carry alone. Sarah moved without conscious thought, crossing the space between them and pulling Elena into her arms. It was awkward at first, 2 soldiers in uniform maintaining the careful distance that military protocol demanded. But then Elena collapsed against her, and Sarah held her the way she'd wished someone had held her during those long nights in the hospital, when she'd wondered why she'd survived when others hadn't. I thought you were dead, Sarah murmured against Elena's hair. For 3 years I thought I had lost you. I thought I'd failed you, Elena whispered back. I thought if I became someone else, maybe I could forget how it felt to hold your life in my hands and almost lose it. They held each other in the dusty motor pool as the sun set over the Montana mountains, 2 soldiers finally finding the courage to face the ghosts that had been haunting them both. But then after a long moment, Sarah pulled back, her hands still resting on Elena's shoulders. So what now? You're Elena Santos again? Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I don't know. Santos died in Afghanistan. Martinez has been living a lie. Maybe it's time to figure out who I actually am. Well, Sarah said, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth, whoever you are, you saved my life. That means something. That means everything. Elena looked down at the dog tag still clutched in her hand. Hayes said you put in for Syria. Running away again? Sarah flinched. I wasn't running. I was... She paused, searching for the right words. I was trying to find myself. Ever since that day at Chapman, I felt like I owed a debt I could never repay. Like I was living on borrowed time. You don't owe me anything. Yes, I do. Sarah's voice was firm. I owe you the chance to stop hiding. I owe you the chance to be proud of what you did, instead of ashamed of what you couldn't do. Elena felt something shift inside her chest, like a door that had been locked for years suddenly swinging open. The transfer? Sarah smiled. A real smile this time, the first genuine expression Elena had seen from her since that morning on the parade ground. I think I'll withdraw that paperwork. Turns out I've got reasons to stay. As they walked out of the motor pool together, Elena slipped the dog tag around her neck for the first time in 3 years. It felt strange but right, like coming home to a place she'd never expected to see again. Behind them, the Montana sky painted itself in shades of orange and gold, a new day ending and another about to begin. And for the first time since Afghanistan, both women felt like they might actually be ready for whatever came next. 6 months later, Staff Sergeant Elena Santos stood before a formation of new recruits at Fort Harrison's medical training facility, her voice carrying across the morning air with quiet authority. Field medicine isn't about following protocols, she said, her eyes scanning the eager faces before her. It's about making impossible decisions with incomplete information while people are dying around you. Anyone can memorize a manual. It takes something deeper to save lives when everything goes wrong. In the back of the group, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell watched with undisguised pride. The transfer to Syria had been officially withdrawn, replaced instead with a permanent assignment as Fort Harrison's deputy commander. Her nights were no longer haunted by the ghost of a dead medic. Instead, she slept peacefully, knowing that the woman who'd saved her life was finally able to save herself. Elena's teaching methods were unconventional. Where other instructors focused on textbook procedures, she taught her students to think, to adapt, to survive when the textbook wasn't enough. Her classroom was part medical bay, part confessional, part warrior's circle, where young medics learned not just how to treat wounds, but how to carry the weight of the lives they would hold in their hands. The hardest part, Elena continued, picking up a field dressing from the supply table, isn't the blood or the screaming or even the dying. The hardest part is learning to forgive yourself for the ones you can't save. A young private in the front row raised his hand. Sergeant Santos, how do you know when you've done enough? Elena paused, her fingers tightening slightly on the bandage. It was a question she'd asked herself 1,000 times in the dark hours after Afghanistan, during the lost years when she'd been Martinez instead of Santos, during every sleepless night when 3 faces haunted her dreams. You don't, she said finally. You never know if you've done enough, but you keep doing it anyway, because the alternative is letting people die who might have lived. The day you stop caring about whether you've done enough is the day you need to find a different job. After the class dismissed, Sarah approached the training area. She moved differently now, less rigid, less haunted. The carefully controlled distance she'd maintained since Afghanistan had given way to something warmer, more human. Good class, she said, falling into step beside Elena as they walked toward the medical facility. They're learning. Slowly, but they're learning. Elena adjusted her uniform cap against the Montana sun. Private Morrison asked me about survivor's guilt yesterday. Kid's 19 and already worried about carrying ghosts. Smart kid, smart teacher. Sarah's voice carried a warmth that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Hayes wants to see you in his office at 14. Something about a commendation. Elena stopped walking. Sarah, we talked about this. I don't want medals or ceremonies or... It's not a medal. Sarah's smile was gentle but firm. It's something else. Something better. An hour later, Elena found herself in General Hayes' office, facing a decision she'd never expected to confront. Spread across his desk were official documents, transfer orders, promotion and paperwork, and a letter bearing the seal of the Army Medical Command. Fort Campbell is requesting you specifically, Hayes explained, his fingers steepled in front of him. They want you to head up a new program training combat medics for special operations units. Your own curriculum, your own methods, your own command. Elena stared at the papers, her mind racing. It was everything she'd never dared to dream of. A chance to make a real difference. To turn her trauma into something that could save lives on a scale she'd never imagined. What about my team here, the recruits I'm training? They'll be fine. You've already taught them more in 6 months than most instructors manage in 2 years. Hayes leaned back in his chair. Elena, you've spent 3 years hiding from who you are. This is your chance to become who you were always meant to be. Elena picked up the transfer orders, scanning the details. Fort Campbell, Kentucky, home of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, where she'd be training the kind of elite medics who deployed into the worst situations imaginable. There's one condition, Hayes continued. They want your current commanding officer to write a recommendation. Something about your leadership potential and ability to work under pressure. Elena's head snapped up. Sarah? Colonel Mitchell has already agreed. In fact, she insisted on it. Hayes pulled out another document, a letter of recommendation 3 pages long, written in Sarah's precise handwriting. Would you like to read what she wrote about you? Elena's hands trembled slightly as she took the letter. Sarah's words painted a picture of a soldier who'd overcome impossible odds, who'd turned trauma into strength and guilt into purpose. But it was the final paragraph that made Elena's breath catch. Staff Sergeant Santos represents the finest tradition of Army medicine, the tradition of those who run toward danger instead of away from it, who measure success not by their own survival, but by the lives they preserve. She taught me that heroism isn't about being unafraid. It's about being afraid and serving anyway. Any unit would be fortunate to have her. More than that, any unit needs her. Elena set the letter down, her vision blurred with unshed tears. She really wrote this? Every word. She also said to tell you that some debts can only be repaid by paying them forward. Hayes gathered the documents and slid them toward Elena. So what do you say, Sergeant Santos? Ready to stop hiding and start leading? Elena looked out the window at the training grounds where young soldiers were learning to save lives. She thought about the faces she'd failed to save in Afghanistan, and the faces she'd succeeded in saving since. She thought about the woman who'd trusted her with her life, and who'd spent 3 years carrying guilt that was never hers to bear. Most of all, she thought about the 19-year-old private who was already worried about survivor's guilt, and all the other young medics who would follow him into situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. When do I leave? She asked. Hayes smiled. 2 weeks. That should give you time to say your goodbyes and tie up loose ends. That evening, Elena found Sarah on the base's observation deck, a small platform overlooking the valley where new recruits ran their daily physical training. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Hayes told me you're taking the assignment, Sarah said without turning around. Thanks to your recommendation. Elena moved to stand beside her at the railing. 3 pages, Sarah. Really? I could have written 30. You saved more than my life in Afghanistan. You saved my faith in what we do here, and why it matters. Sarah finally turned to face her, and Elena was surprised to see no sadness in her expression. Instead, there was something that looked like pride mixed with anticipation. I'm going to miss this place, Elena admitted. Miss the work. Miss... Me? Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. Yeah, I'm going to miss you. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out something small and metallic. Elena's dog tag. Not the Martinez one she'd worn for 3 years, but the Santos tag that had spent so long in Hayes' desk drawer. I had the engraver add something, Sarah said, pressing the tag into Elena's palm. Elena looked down and saw new words etched below her name and service number. Echo Zulu 9, never forgotten. Sarah. The radio call signed from that day. So you remember that some battles are worth fighting, some lives are worth saving, and some people are worth carrying when they can't carry themselves. Elena closed her fingers around the tag, feeling its familiar weight. But this time, instead of burden, it felt like possibility. What about you? What happens when I'm gone? Sarah smiled, and it was the first completely unguarded expression Elena had seen from her since Afghanistan. I've got a base to run and soldiers to train, and for the first time in 3 years, I'm not carrying any ghosts. They stood together in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over Fort Harrison. Around them, the base continued its eternal rhythm, soldiers training, learning, preparing for missions they couldn't yet imagine. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new recruits to train, new lives to save or lose. But tonight, Two women who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances stood quietly together, no longer haunted by the past, finally ready for whatever the future might hold. Elena Santos was going home, not to a place, but to herself, to the soldier she'd always been meant to be, the teacher she'd become, the leader she was finally ready to embrace. And somewhere in the distance, a bugle played taps, its mournful notes carrying across the Montana night like a prayer for all the battles yet to be fought, all the lives yet to be saved, and all the heroes yet to discover their own courage. The dead were finally at peace, the living were ready to serve, and Elena Santos, medic, teacher, survivor, was ready to lead them.